Hello, I'm back. Today I want to talk about those little goblin freaks that horror movies are so obsessed with. You know the ones I mean, the short ones that go to school and shit. You know, kids. Horror movies love using kids as antagonists, despite the fact that we're meant to find them cute and innocent, I guess. So today I want to talk about what actually makes kids in horror films so unsettling, and why it's such an effective tool. Recently I watched both Hereditary and John in the Hole, which both feature freaky little kids, but in very different ways. One of them is literally possessed by the King of Hell, and the other is basically just a gamer with a thing for older women.
I can't stay here, John. I have a family, things to do. You know what? Let me call your mother.
But somehow, at least to me, they're equally unsettling in their own ways. And I think that's because, at the core of it, these films are playing with the same thing. The fundamentals of what a kid is supposed to be. So let's start with possessed kids. That's films like Hereditary, The Exorcist, and The Shining. These are all films that explain a kid's evil actions through supernatural means. Usually a demon or some sort of ancient force. Or quite often just the spirit of an old woman.
All you do is complain, complain, complain!
What?
My point being that they're always possessed by something mature and developed. Something that just doesn't belong in a kid's body. And that setup matters because it means that the kid isn't really being framed as evil. The kid is usually innocent, or at least it's supposed to be. These kinds of films usually start from a place of innocence. The audience is naturally encouraged to trust the child, or at least pity them. Then little by little, the kid moves further and further away from where you expect a child to be. Not all at once, just enough for you to go, nah, that kid's a wrong'un. When the girl in Hereditary picks up the scissors, you immediately know that that little demon's gonna do something fucked up. Because there's clearly something malicious about it. It doesn't look like a kid doing something stupid or impulsive. It looks like someone who knows exactly what they're doing. And that's the part that's so unsettling. Because normally when a kid does something bad, you just assume that it was an accident, although the kid doesn't know any better.
Did you shut the cat in the cabinet? Why did you do that?
But when a possessed kid does something violent, it doesn't feel like that. It feels deliberate. Like there's a full-grown adult behind those eyes making decisions. And that's where the horror really kicks in. Because the body is still a child, but the behavior isn't. You've got a tiny person standing there with the confidence and awareness of something much older. And suddenly the dynamic in the room changes. The adults aren't dealing with a child anymore, they're dealing with something pretending to be one. And I know this is on purpose, but it's so annoying because the audience always figures this out before the parents.
Charlie! I mean, what are you doing? Leaving the house barefoot.
The kid will say something completely insane, or stare at someone for way too long like they're trying to figure out the best way to lob your head off. And the parents will always just be like, oh, she's going through a phase. Like, no mate, she's currently looking into my soul with her back to me halfway up my wall speaking Latin. This is not a phase. That is not puberty kicking in, trust me. But yeah, horror films obviously stretch out the parents' denial for a reason. The audience will know something's wrong and the parents will just explain it away. And then the tension will just build until everyone agrees that this is not your average kid. And at that point, the horror isn't just there's a demon. It's that the parents now have to deal with the fact that the thing standing in front of them still looks like their child. Because if there was just a demon standing in the room, we'd know what to do. Call a priest, burn the house down and start praying. But when the demon is wearing the face of your child, it makes things a bit complicated. Now saying that, if this girl walked into my room in the middle of the night, daughter or not, I'm grabbing the nearest hard object. Do you kill your innocent yet bird decapitating daughter? Or do you just hope that the demon eventually gets bored and possesses somebody else's kid? But what do you do if there is no demon to be exorcised? Now I personally think that's the scariest form of child horror, because that's when you lose the comfort of an explanation. In films like We Need to Talk About Kevin or John in the Hole, the horror in those films comes from the fact that the child's actions are entirely their own. There's no demon to blame it on, just a kid deciding to do something fucked up. And that to me is way worse, because it means the child isn't being used by some outside force. They are the force. And unlike possessed child films where there's usually some hope that the kid can be restored, These films don't really offer that comfort. There's no parasite to remove, no dramatic exorcism or a final moment where the kid wakes up and they're normal again. This is just who they are. And that to me is scary because it can happen in real life. Kids can be awful to each other, to animals, to teachers, or basically anything that's weaker than them. I know you tortured some insects when you were a kid. I speak for the bugs, okay? But yeah, which side note is another reason that I'm never gonna have kids. Because if by some chance my child turns out to be anything like the kids in these films, you best believe I'm gonna go get some milk. Sadly, the dad in John and the Hole decides to do a very different approach, which is unfortunate because that kid is not right. What makes John and the Hole especially creepy is that the kid doesn't seem cruel in any traditional sense. He doesn't come across like some little cackling villain. He's just curious. And curiosity obviously is normal for kids. That's part of the problem. A lot of the bad things that kids do begin with curiosity. Some kids put salt on a slug because they heard it at school, or lock their siblings in a cupboard just to see what happens. And we usually assume that the kid has enough humanity to stop when it gets serious, or at least when their mum starts shouting from downstairs. But horror films push that logic to its limit. They take a very recognizable childish instinct, curiosity, experimentation, and attachment, and then they strip it of the moral breaks. So what you're left with is curiosity without empathy. And that's what makes John and the Hole so uncomfortable, because it doesn't feel impossible. It just feels like a version of childhood where something vital was never switched on. And like I said earlier, this version of childhood where something vital doesn't get switched on can happen in the real world. There's no shortage of real-life cases where children have done horrific things out of curiosity. A pretty infamous example being the 2014 Slenderman stabbings, where two girls committed a horrific crime to see if it would make Slenderman appear. Unfortunately, that case is a good example of why kids work so well in horror, because kids don't have the same internal boundaries that adults do, or at least not fully developed ones. I do think there's some level of innate morals when you're young, but for the most part, kids learn what they can and can't do from adults around them. And in my opinion, that leaves a little bit too much room for something to go wrong. We can't always predict what a kid is thinking. We can't always tell what they actually understand. And that unpredictability is what horror films are trying to exploit. Because most horror stories, no matter what form it takes, rely on the same idea. And that's that you don't know what the antagonist is capable of. And that applies to ghosts, monsters, children, and the ghosts of old women. Rarely old men for some reason, but that's a whole nother video. But yeah, I think that's why kids are such a good horror device. Not because they're inherently scary, most of them are just sticky and loud, but because they're unpredictable in a very specific way. Adults in horror movies have a motive. Even if they're evil, you assume there's some sort of logic behind it. But with children, the line between innocence and cruelty is a lot thinner. Kids can do something deeply disturbing and not fully understand the consequences.
I was concerned that you might be feeling responsible.
Why's that?
Or worse, they can understand it just enough. And horror films love that ambiguity. A possessed child is scary because it looks innocent, but it contains something a lot more deliberate. A non-possessed child is scary because there's nothing to blame. No supernatural explanation, no way of separating the child from the harm that they've caused. And I think that's why these stories stick so much with people. Because what these films are trying to do is take the one figure that seems harmless, the innocent child, and turn it into a threat. Not through physical strength like a monster, but by placing something unsettling behind the face that we trust. Sometimes these films resolve themselves by defeating whatever force is possessing the child, allowing the demon or curse to leave. That resolution gives the audience a strange kind of relief, because it reframes the horror that we just experienced as something external, a temporary corruption rather than proof that that child could ever be capable of cruelty. Yes, a family member might have been thrown across a room, but at least the moral structure of the world has been restored. The evil came from somewhere else. And once it's gone, the child can return to being what a child is supposed to be. Innocent, supporting the idea that people begin life fundamentally good. But the stories that tend to stay with you are the ones that don't give you an explanation. The ones where there is no demon, no curse, no supernatural force to blame. Instead, the film simply presents a child that chooses to do something horrific, and leaves the audience to sit with the uncomfortable idea that nothing external caused it. Because children occupy a very specific place in how we think about the world. They're the one group that we collectively agree should be innocent, protected, and fundamentally good. Entire social systems are built around that assumption. So when horror films place cruelty, malice, and calculated violence in that body, they aren't just showing you something scary. They're breaking one of the most basic rules that we have about the world. A monster's frightening because it's scary. A child is frightening because it's not. And innocence might not be as reliable as we think. Anyway, let me know in the comments what the most diabolical thing you did as a child was. And thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye!